Hey there, history enjoyers. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and if you're watching this while trying to fall asleep, don't, because once you hear how people used hand gestures in medieval times, you might just keep one hand under your blanket for safety reasons. Because in the Middle Ages, what you didn't say could hurt you, and what you did say with your hands could get you killed. Let's set the scene. It's the year 1347. The Black Death is spreading. Kings are marrying cousins, and somewhere in England, a farmer just accidentally flipped off a noble without knowing what it meant. Medieval people didn't exactly have emojis or memes to express themselves. No, or they had something even more dangerous. Gestures. A flick of a finger, a tilt of the chin, or even scratching. Your beard in the wrong direction could communicate everything from good day to prepare to die. And here's the fun part. No one agreed on what any of it meant. The origins of the medieval middle finger. Let's start with the most famous one. Yes, that finger. Now, people like to say the middle finger came from English archers during the 100 Years' War. You've probably heard the story. The French captured English archers and cut off their index and middle fingers so they couldn't shoot arrows again. So, before battle, the English would show their middle fingers to the French, proudly declaring, "We still have them." Sounds cool, right? Totally fake. There's no historical record of that happening. But the idea of offensive hand gestures existed long before that story was even told. The ancient Romans already used the middle finger called the digitus imputicus, or the shameless finger. It was a symbol of male anatomy and an insult meaning. Well, use your imagination. By the Middle Ages, the gesture had traveled across Europe, morphing slightly depending on the country. In Italy, it meant something explicit. In England, it meant something else explicit. In France, it meant you were either threatening someone or flirting with them, depending on the context. Medieval life was confusing like that . Polite gestures that weren't so polite. Not all gestures were meant to be rude. Some were supposed to be polite, but ended up being deadly . Take, for example, the medieval blessing. Gesture. You've seen it in old paintings, 2 fingers up. Thumb out, like a priest throwing holy energy. It looked peaceful, divine even, but if you did that gesture in the wrong place, say, in front of a peasant mob who thought you were mocking the church, you might not live long. Enough to explain that you were just copying the bishop. Even waving wasn't safe. The modern high hand wave didn't exist yet. In the 14th century, showing your open palm was actually a signal of submission. You were showing you didn't have a weapon. So imagine someone trying to greet you enthusiastically across the market square, waving like crazy, and everyone else thinks they're surrendering to a fight. Oops. Gestures that could get you in trouble. The medieval world loved drama, and gestures were like their version of reality TV. In France, touching the tip of your nose could mean I know your secret. In Italy, biting your thumb was the 14th century equivalent of flipping someone off. Shakespeare even included it in Romeo and Juliet. Do you bite your thumb at us, sir? That wasn't about snacksit, was an invitation to fight. Meanwhile, in England, Raising two fingers palm inward was considered deeply insulting, like saying, "Screw you," and here's the catch, raising them palm outward, like a peace sign, meant victory. Centuries later, so you could see how a misunderstanding could happen, one poor traveller flashes a V for victory in medieval London, and suddenly he's got three angry bakers chasing him with rolling pins. The church's take, holy or heresy, because gestures carried meaning. The church, being the medieval moral police, had a lot to say about them. Clergy manuals from the 12th and 13th centuries actually warned priests about sinful. One bishop even declared that laughing too hard or waving one's hands excessively was a temptation of the devil. Apparently, Satan wasn't into jazz hands, and during confession, priests were trained to recognize nonverbal guilt. If someone touched their mouth, scratched their neck, or looked at the floor, it might mean they were lying. So yes, even back then, they had their own version of medieval lie detectors. Only instead of a polygraph, you got judged by a man in robes holding a candle. But gestures weren't all bad. In fact, they were a vital part of medieval communicationist, especially among monks. See, monks took vows of silence, so they developed elaborate sign languages to talk without speaking. A Benedictine monk could say entire sentences using just hand signs. For instance, equals bread, equals wine, equals prayer, and a closed fist equals shut up, Brother Thomas. This silent code became so refined that some monks could debate theology entirely without words. Imagine two bald men in robes aggressively Latin philosophy at each other for hours. It was the medieval version of sign language TED Talks. The dangerous power of the wrong gesture. Gestures could cross class lines too. A knight might interpret a commoner's movement as an insult, even if it wasn't meant to be. In 1350, a Flemish peasant was recorded as being executed for raising his hand with disrespect toward a noble. What did he actually do? He pointed, that's it. He pointed his finger at the wrong man. In medieval society, the act of pointing could imply accusation, command, or mockery. If a peasant pointed at a knight, it was as if he'd said, "You're beneath me." And that was treason. No wonder everyone looked so miserable in medieval paintings. Half of them were probably trying not to move their hands. The ritual of gloves. Talking without words. Now here's something fascinating. Gloves weren't just for warmth. They were symbols of power, loyalty, and insult. A noble could throw down a glove to challenge someone to a duel. That's where the phrase, "throw down the gauntlet," comes from. But handing someone your glove politely, that meant trust. In one medieval romance tale, a lady gives her knight a single glove before he rides into battle. It's romantic until he returns, drops the glove at her feet, and walks away. In gesture language, that meant, "I reject your love." No text messages needed. Just heartbreak in leather form. The 15th century saw an explosion of dueling culture. Every slight, every smirk, every flick of the wrist could start a fight. One Venetian record describes two merchants dueling because one of them raised his eyebrow too high. In another case, a knight accused another of silent mockery, apparently. He smiled while bowing. These people really needed hobbies. But here's the thing, gestures mattered because in a world with limited literacy, body language was language. If words were rare, gestures were everything, and that meant they could build reputations or destroy them. So, what's left of all this today? More than you'd think. The peace sign evolved from that rude medieval two-finger salute, the OK hand sign. In medieval Europe, that could mean zero, but in some places, it meant you're worthless. Even nodding and shaking your head didn't mean yes and no everywhere. In parts of medieval Greece, nodding meant no, which means somewhere in history, someone definitely agreed to get married by accident. So next time you wave, point, or throw up a peace sign, remember, in another century that could have been an act of war. The medieval world didn't have Twitter, TikTok, or comment sections, but trust me, their gestures said plenty. Every raised eyebrow, every flicked finger, every subtle motion had a story. And those stories remind us that human communication, whether it's a meme or a middle finger, has always been a little bit dangerous. Picture a medieval court. A king sits on a throne heavy enough to crush his spine, surrounded by nobles trying not to blink too disrespectfully. Here, gestures were everything. A single bow could elevate your status or end your career. When greeting the king, you had to perform what was called the reverence. It wasn't just bowing, it was practically a yoga sequence. You stepped forward, extended your right hand, but not too far. That was insolent, bent the knee, but not too deep. That was mocking and lowered your gaze. If you made eye contact by accident, congratulations, you just challenged royal authority. One chronicler in the court of Edward III actually noted how a certain Lord of Cornwall did incline to shallowly before his majesty and was dismissed. Thenceforth from service. Translation, the guy didn't bow low enough and lost his job. Even the way you kissed a royal hand was ranked. A noble could kiss the ring. A baron could kiss the fingertips. A peasant, he didn't get close enough to even see the hand. So, your hierarchy wasn't spoken. It was choreographed, the gesture of power, hand of the king. Medieval monarchs were obsessed with symbolic gestures. They believed that touch itself carried divine authority. Kings didn't just rule, they healed. Literally, the royal touch was a sacred gesture where monarchs laid hands on the sick, believing God had given them the power to cure diseases like scrofula. Spoiler, it didn't work, but it did make them look holy while pretending to do healthcare. In France, the ceremony was massive. People lined up for hours just to have the king's fingers brush their forehead. Chroniclers described one such event in 1422, where Charles VII touched hundreds of peasants in one morning. Half fainted, half cried, and probably all got sick again 2 weeks later. This gesture wasn't just spiritual, it was political theater. Every touch reminded the people, my hands are sacred, yours are dirty. Medieval law didn't have fancy contracts or digital signatures. They had oaths, and oaths were sealed with hands. When two men swore loyalty, they didn't just shake hands. They performed a ritual called homage. The vassal would kneel, place his hands between the lord's, and say, I am your man. It sounds romantic until you realize it was basically feudal handcuffing. This wasn't a casual gesture, was legally binding. Breaking that oath meant betrayal. Betrayal meant death, and if you refused to accept someone's hands in yours, that was a declaration of war. There's even a record from the 11th century where a lord refused a vassal's homage because his hands were unclean from labor. Yes, you heard that right, he rejected loyalty because the guy had dirt under his nails. Medieval politics was basically kindergarten with swords. Gestures in the church when holiness got complicated. Now we can't talk about medieval gestures without going back to church. Because oh boy, no one gestured harder than medieval priests. Every prayer, blessing, and ritual had precise hand positions. 2 fingers up meant Christ's dual nature. 3 fingers, the Holy Trinity. 5 fingers spread wide, either invoking divine protection or accidentally summoning gossip. But here's the twist. These gestures changed over time. In the 9th century, priests blessed with 2 fingers. By the 13th, they switched to 3. Some traditionalists got mad. One monk from Milan even wrote an entire letter complaining that those who raise 3 fingers are heretics and mockers of truth. Imagine losing your salvation because you used the wrong number of fingers. Medieval Catholicism was intense. Handshake, the origins of trust and suspicion. We think of a handshake as friendly, but in the Middle Ages, it was anything but casual. The handshake was a warrior's gesture, meant to show that neither man was hiding a weapon, but you didn't just shake, you gripped. Hard, maintaining eye contact the entire time. If you looked away too soon, it meant weakness. There's a 12th century account from a German chronicler describing 2 knights who clasped hands for so long that their fingers turned purple. Neither wanted to release first. Eventually, both fainted. The chronicler concluded, thus peace was achieved. So yes, even friendship was mildly violent. The art of insulting without speaking. The medieval elite had a special skill, insulting people silently. At court, you couldn't openly mock someone, you'd get exiled or executed. So instead, nobles developed a complex system of polite-looking rudeness. For instance, slowly removing your glove before shaking someone's hand meant, I think you're unclean. Touching your own sword hilt during conversation, I could kill you, but I won't. Yeah. Tilting your head slightly left. You bore me, and perhaps the most devastating one, offering your left hand for a handshake. The left hand was considered sinister, literally from Latin using it for greeting was a coded insult, implying someone was unworthy of your right. Medieval Europe, where even a handshake could ruin your week. Diplomacy and the danger of misreading. Imagine being an ambassador in the 1300s. You travel for weeks to deliver a treaty, wearing 40 pounds of itchy wool, finally reach the foreign court and then accidentally offend the entire kingdom by pointing with 1 finger instead of 2. That actually happened. In 1356, an English diplomat visiting Aragon was recorded as having raised a single finger while speaking to the king. Apparently, in Aragonese custom, that gesture meant I speak above you. The Englishman had meant it as emphasis. He was thrown out of court within the hour. Diplomatic manuals from the late medieval period actually included chapters on how to gesture properly abroad, because one misplaced movement could cost your country an alliance or start a war. International relations back then were basically a never-ending game of charades with consequences, chivalry and the gestures of love. Not all gestures were deadly, some were delightfully romantic, or at least that's what poets wanted you to think. Knights used gestures to communicate with their ladies during tournaments. Touching the heart meant devotion. Lowering the lance slightly before charging meant I fight for you, and if he caught her glove or ribbon mid-battle, he'd tie it to his armor as a symbol of loyalty. But again, context was everything. Dropping her token meant disgrace. Returning it meant heartbreak, and accidentally catching the wrong lady's glove could lead to a duel and possibly death by misunderstanding. In the medieval world, romance wasn't just tragic, it was hand signal dangerous. Gestures of peace and surrender. War was constant, but so were the rituals to end it. A defeated knight could signal surrender simply by removing his helmet and opening both palms toward his enemy. But if he raised just one hand, it could be read as defiance. Many men were killed trying to surrender the wrong way. One chronicler during the Crusades described a group of Saracen warriors attempting to surrender by kneeling and touching the ground with their foreheads, a custom in their culture. The Crusaders misread it as mockery and attacked again. Cross-cultural communication, medieval edition, catastrophic, the glove duel, symbolic violence. You know the phrase, throwing down the gauntlet. It wasn't just dramatic, it was deadly serious. When a knight challenged another, he literally threw his glove at the opponent's feet. If the glove was picked up, the duel was on. If it wasn't, humiliation for life. There's even one record from Burgundy, where a noble threw someone else's glove to start a duel on their behalf. The poor guy had no idea until the next morning when he woke up to find half the court expecting bloodshed. Moral of the story: never leave your gloves unattended in medieval Europe. The gesture revolution from violence to etiquette. By the late 15th century, something interesting happened. Gestures started to soften. As Renaissance culture spread, nobles began to see exaggerated gestures as barbaric. Etiquette manuals appeared, basically medieval self-help books for your hands. One of the most famous, Erasmus's De Civilitate Morum Puerilium, 1530, taught young nobles how to behave gracefully. He warned, "Let not your hands wander like those of a madman. Keep them modestly at rest." Basically, stop flailing your arms like a barbarian. The civilized man was calm, composed, and minimal in motion. In other words, the Renaissance invented resting rich face. The death gesture, last signs of life. Even in death, gestures mattered. Nobles were often buried with their hands in specific poses. Palms up, humility before God. Hands crossed on the chest, piety. Hands clasping a sword, eternal be. And if you were really holy, your body might be displayed with one hand raised in blessing. A final gesture to remind everyone, I'm dead, but still holier than you. Closing thoughts. So by now, you can see that medieval gestures weren't just random. Movements, they were an entire social language. Your hands told people your class, your loyalty, your faith, your mood, and occasionally your last words, from royal courts to monasteries, from duels to diplomacy. The entire medieval world was a silent performance, a ballet of meaning, etiquette, and misunderstanding. And honestly, not much has changed. We still use hand gestures to say what words can't. The difference is that now, if you accidentally offend someone, you just get cancelled online, not executed by a knight with good posture. Prayer was basically choreography. Let's start with the basics. Praying. In theory, it's simple: close your eyes. Put your hands together and hope someone up there is listening. But in the Middle Ages, it was never that simple. The church turned prayer into a full-body performance. There were entire manuals describing the proper posture before God. Hands must be clasped not too tightly, that's desperation. Not too loosely, that's arrogance. Eyes must be downcast, knees bent, back straight, mouth closed. Basically, look miserable but elegant. Even children were drilled on this. In one 13th century guide for young monks, it says, "Let the boy pray as one who fears being seen, not as one who seeks to be seen." That's medieval for stop showing off when you're praying. But of course, showing off was the point. In crowded cathedrals, the faithful competed to look the most humble. One chronicler even complained that women faint for holiness too frequently. Translation: the prayer mosh pit was getting out of control. The holy hand signs of power. Now, remember those paintings where saints are holding up to fingers like they're posing for a 12th century selfie? That wasn't random. That was sacred geometry. The two raised fingers represented Christ's dual nature, fully human, fully divine. Meanwhile, the thumb tucked under them symbolized the Holy Spirit. This gesture of benediction was so standardized that people could tell which church faction you belonged to based on your finger arrangement. By the 13th century, the Western Church started blessing with 3 fingers instead of 2 to emphasize the Trinity. The Eastern Orthodox still used to, and suddenly everyone was calling everyone else a heretic over finger math. Imagine going to hell because your bishop held up the wrong number of digits. Medieval theology was basically a divine version of rock, paper scissors, but with eternal consequences. Fear as a gesture. Medieval faith wasn't gentle, it was performative terror. Every sermon, every ritual, every movement was designed to make you afraid. Priests preached with hand gestures that looked halfway between Shakespeare and street mime. They'd point to the heavens dramatically, slap their chests, raise their arms wide, or wave their fingers at the crowd like divine traffic cops, and the congregation responded in kind, crossing themselves rapidly, bowing, touching their lips, their heart, their forehead, over and over again like a choreography of fear. The sign of the cross wasn't casual like today's little forehead tap. Back then, it was a full body motion. Forehead gives, chest gives, left shoulder gives, right shoulder gives. Kiss your thumb gives, mumble a Latin line you didn't fully understand. Every gesture had meaning. Every gesture was being watched. Because if you crossed yourself too slowly, someone might whisper, "Heretic," gestures that could get you killed. The church loved order and it hated improvisation. So, naturally, any unapproved gestures were dangerous. In 1312, A French preacher was arrested because he gestured too passionately while describing the Holy Spirit. The Inquisition decided that meant he was possessed. Spoiler, he was burned. Women, in particular, were under scrutiny. The Church taught that excessive motion was a sign of Eve's weakness. So women were told to move minimally during prayer, to fold their hands small, bow modestly, and never raise their arms unless directed. One medieval theologian, Bernard of Clairvaux, wrote, "The devil enters through laughter and wild hands." So basically, if you were happy and expressive, congratulations, you were probably possessed. Kneeling, the original control mechanism. We think of kneeling as reverence. But in the Middle Ages, it was about obedience. The act of kneeling before God was deliberately modeled on kneeling before your feudal lord. It reminded you of your place small, powerless, dependent. In monasteries, monks had to kneel dozens of times a day. The rule of Saint Benedict literally measured holiness by the number of times you bent your knees, and if your knees didn't touch the floor, you weren't humble enough. One chronicler from the 1100s described an abbot who demanded that all brothers press their faces to the ground until their breath was lost. That wasn't piety, that was a medieval CrossFit routine. Kneeling became so central that when peasants rebelled, kings often demanded public kneeling as part of their surrender. You didn't just confess your sins, you confessed your social status, the sign of peace that started fights. At Mass, there was a moment called the pox, or kiss of peace. The idea was simple. Before communion, everyone symbolically forgave each other. In early centuries, they literally kissed mouth to mouth. Yes, during church. You can imagine how that went. By the 13th century, the church got tired of the holy make-out session, so they replaced it with a physical object called a pax border small plaque. Everyone kissed in order, comma. Sounds civilized, right? Except people started fighting over who got to kiss first. Records from English cathedrals show that many quarrels and strikes have arisen. From the order of the pox, they turned peace into a contact sport, monastic silence, the language of signs. In monasteries, silence was sacred. But humans can't not communicate. So monks invented their own secret language of gestures, clear and surprisingly funny. Want bread? Want wine? Well, technically, a circular motion with 2 fingers. Need to go to the bathroom? Make a fist and shake it twice. They had hundreds of these signs. One Benedictine manual lists gestures for cheese, fish, book, amen, and Brother Peter, please stop snoring. These monastic gestures weren't sinful because they were regulated. They existed under church authority. You could move your hands if the church said so. That's the medieval paradox. Silence wasn't silence. It was obedience disguised as peace. The theater of penance. When you sinned, everyone did you had to perform it. Confession wasn't private like today. In the early Middle Ages, penance was public. Sinners were made to stand or kneel before the congregation, often wearing rags or ashes, and gesture their remorse with outstretched arms or bowed heads. Sometimes they were even forced to walk through town making the sign of the cross repeatedly. To prove their repentance, people threw things, kids mocked them. It was humiliation turned into religious performance. The church believed visible shame purified the soul. In other words, God liked drama, gestures, and the fear of the body. The church's obsession with gestures wasn't really about holiness. It was about control. They feared the body. Hands could steal. Eyes could lust. Tongues could lie. So they built a system where every movement had to be purified. Even eating was written. You couldn't lift your spoon too fast or open your mouth too wide. Monks were warned that food swallowed in haste is sin in motion. By regulating movement, the church regulated thought. Gesture became theology. Stillness became virtue. Death and the final gesture. When someone died, their body was posed carefully. Hands folded, eyes closed, feet aligned toward the altar. Priests would guide the dying through the commendation of the soul, literally lifting their hands for them if they were too weak. Because dying wrong without the right gesture could mean your soul got lost. Some people were buried with their hands bound as a symbol of humility before God. Others had their fingers arranged in the sign of the cross. And if you were excommunicated, they'd bury you with your hands open, symbolizing that heaven was now closed to you. Yes, even in death, your fingers had rules. They say actions speak louder than words. But in medieval Europe, a single finger could scream treason, insult your king, or accidentally challenge someone to a duel. And no, we're not talking about that finger. Well, not only that finger. You see, in a world where literacy was a luxury and church bells were your daily notifications, people relied on gestures to communicate. But the thing about gestures, they travel faster than language. And sometimes what means good luck in one village could mean I hope your cow dies in the next. Welcome to the medieval middle finger multiverse, where every move of your hand might just be your last. Let's start with the most obvious, the fig sign, or as the Italians called it, monofico. You make it by tucking your thumb between your index and middle finger. Looks innocent, right? Wrong. In ancient Rome, this gesture was used to ward off evil spirits, kind of like carrying a garlic necklace, but less smelly. But by the Middle Ages, its meaning evolved into something a bit more anatomical. It became a symbol for female genitalia, a crude mockery of fertility, and, well, a rude way of saying screw you. Imagine walking through a medieval marketplace, happily showing the fig sign, because your uncle told you it keeps demons away, and suddenly you're surrounded by angry knights who think you just called their mothers indecent names. Congratulations. You've just learned how to die via hand gesture, but it didn't stop there. In England and France, gestures were a political weapon, literally. Take the famous visi, made by raising two fingers, index and middle, with the palm facing inward. Today, that might mean peace if you flip it around, but back then, it was the medieval equivalent of saying, "Come get me, coward." Legend has it, during the 100 Years' War, English longbowmen would taunt the French by showing the fingers they used to draw their bows. The message was simple. We still have our fingers and we're about to use them. Now, whether or not that story is historically accurate doesn't even matter anymore, because it's too good not to believe. And that's how half of Europe started insulting each other using a symbol that modern teens now use in selfies. History has a dark sense of humor. Meanwhile, in monasteries, yes, even monks had their own hand drama. You might think a vow of silence meant peace and quiet, but actually it just meant more hand signals. Each monastery had its own silent language. Hundreds of signs to represent words like bread, book, water, and wine. But here's the problem. Gestures were not universal. So when one monastery visited another, chaos ensued. Picture this. A group of Benedictine monks travels to meet the one monk signs wine, please, using his hand. The other stares in horror because that exact gesture in his monastery means confession of lustful thoughts. And now everyone's blushing. Nobody's drinking. And the abbot thinks there's a scandal brewing, all because of one poorly timed hand wave. Then there's the royal gesture code, the secret body language of kings, queens, and courtiers. In medieval courts, where saying the wrong thing could cost your head, gestures were used to signal everything: approval, insult, even secret alliances. A simple nod from a noble might mean, I support your claim, while a hand on the sword hilt might mean, I'm seconds away from supporting your death. Chroniclers recorded entire diplomatic breakdowns caused by misinterpreted gestures. A French envoy once refused to bow as low as expected before the English king, and the English, being the English, took that as a personal attack. War didn't start that day, but it certainly didn't help. And of course, the ultimate forbidden gesture, the raised middle finger. It existed, yes. It was as rude then as it is now. But it was rare, because in a time when your hands were tools of survival, you didn't waste one just to make a point. Still, in some medieval plays and tavern jokes, the gesture appears usually as part of farce or mockery, a way to ridicule the upper class without actually saying anything treasonous. Because what's safer than insulting your lord using a gesture only the peasants understand? That's medieval protest art, baby. What's fascinating is how these gestures outlived their context. Something that could have gotten you whipped in 1320 now lives rent-free in internet memes. The fig sign is still used in parts of Europe. The V scene is still confusing, depending on which way your hand faces. And the middle finger, well, it's gone global. So next time you flash a peace sign for your selfie, remember, somewhere in medieval France, that exact gesture might have earned you a slap, an insult, or a duel. Because in the medieval world, words were dangerous, but hands were deadlier. So if you ever find yourself time traveling to the 13th century, keep your mouth shut. And for the love of history, keep your hands in your pockets. Ah, medieval love. It wasn't about roses, or poetry, or late-night texts that start with you up. It was about surviving a system where eye contact could be illegal, and a single gesture could mean the difference between romance and execution. And you thought modern dating was confusing. Let's start with something simple. The hand over the heart. Sweet, right? Romantic, classic. Well, in the 13th century, that gesture didn't just mean, I love you. It could also mean, I swear, before God. So if you accidentally clutched your chest while talking to a noble woman, congratulations, you just swore a sacred oath of loyalty. And if you didn't follow through, that's called perjury, and it was punishable by losing that very hand. Yes, medieval chivalry came with built-in legal clauses. But of course, no story of love gestures is complete without the bow and the hand kiss. Today, we see that, as classy, the mark of a gentleman. Back then, it was a political landmine. The act of kissing a lady's hand in medieval courts had about 17 different meanings, depending on who you were, who she was, where you did it, and who was watching. If you were a knight greeting a noblewoman, it meant respect. If you held her hand too long, it meant flirtation. If you kissed it twice, it meant proposal. And if you kissed it in public without permission, that meant execution by sunrise. Courtly love was all fun and games until someone's lips lingered a second too long. And that brings us to the coded gestures of courtly romance, the secret body, language of flirtation, that existed because, well, you couldn't just say, "Hey, you're cute." Most noble ladies were under constant supervision, so they developed subtle, silent gestures to communicate with their lovers. A dropped glove, "I miss you," a hand on the veil, "Meet me later," a rose in the hair, "My husband's home, abort mission." Imagine medieval Tinder, but every swipe could send you to prison. Then there's the symbolic exchange of hands, the foundation of medieval marriage itself. The phrase to give one's hand in marriage wasn't just poetic. It was literal. During the ceremony, the groom physically placed his hand inside the bride's, and a priest would wrap a stole around them, symbolizing unity and submission. But here's the fun part. In some regions, if a man publicly took a woman's hand and she didn't pull away, that counted as a legally binding engagement. You could basically get betrothed by accident. Picture this. You're at a feast. It's loud, there's wine everywhere, and you reach out to steady a lady so she doesn't trip. Boom. Next morning, the village priests knocking on your door like, "Congrats, you're getting married on Sunday." Medieval romance, no take, but gestures of love could turn dark real fast. For example, offering a handkerchief wasn't just romantic, it could be treasonous. Knights often carried a lady's kerchief as a token of affection during tournaments, but if that lady was married to another noble, or worse, the queen, you just turned your love life into an act of rebellion. There are chronicled cases where knights were executed not for touching the queen, but for holding her embroidered napkin. Imagine dying because you borrowed someone's tissue. And then there's the secret handshake of betrayal. Oh yes, that existed too. During negotiations, clasping hands was a symbol of faith and alliance, what we'd now call a handshake deal. But if you gripped too tightly, twisted the wrist, or failed to meet the other man's gaze, it was interpreted as deceit. One chronicler from the 14th century tells of a peace meeting between two rival lords. They clasped hands before witnesses, but one lord squeezed too hard. The other took it as an insult. By sunset, both armies were back at war. So, moral of the story, never underestimate the political power of sweaty palms. Even gestures of prayer and devotion weren't safe from romantic misinterpretation. A knight kneeling before a lady was a classic act of chivalry, of declaration of service, respect, and occasionally infatuation, but kneeling too long, too deep, with your hands clasped, you might as well be proposing. Court chroniclers recorded dozens of awkward, non-proposals where a knight was just being polite, and the lady's family started planning a wedding. Sometimes the knight had to flee the region to avoid getting forcibly married. Medieval ghosting, the original art form. What's both hilarious and tragic is how gestures became a language for emotions people weren't allowed to express. They couldn't write love letters, that was dangerous. They couldn't speak their feelings, that was scandalous. So they talked with hands, eyes, and veils instead. And that's why medieval tapestries are full of people staring dramatically at each other while pretending to pick flowers, because that was the only way to say I love you, in public without losing your head. War in the Middle Ages wasn't elegant. It was loud, smoky, confusing, and most importantly, terribly bad for communication. There were no walkie-talkies, no drones, no group chat, crusaders only. If you wanted your army to move, attack, or not accidentally stab you, you had to rely on gestures. And oh boy, did that go wrong. Let's start with the basics. The wave. In modern times, waving is friendly. You do it when you see someone across the street or when your teacher catches you pretending not to use your phone. But in the 13th century, a wave could mean charge forward, retreat immediately, or don't shoot me. I'm on your side. Depending on which country you were in and which direction the sun was facing. There are chronicles of entire battles lost because one commander lifted his arm at the wrong moment. In 1266, a group of French soldiers supposedly mistook a knight's halt signal for attack. They rushed straight into enemy archers. It was, as one monk later wrote, a gesture most unfortunate. That's medieval Latin for you idiots. Now, imagine this problem times 10. During Crusades, you had French knights, German mercenaries, Italian sailors, and local Byzantine guides, all fighting under the same banners but speaking zero of the same language. So they used hand signs. Raise your sword equals move forward. Tap your chest equals hold formation. Spin your weapon in the air equals victory. Except not everyone got the same memo. In one 12th century skirmish near Antioch, an Italian captain raised his hand to signal hold position. The German knights saw it as charge now. The French crossbowmen thought it meant praise be to God. They all did their own thing, and that's how a single gesture turned into 40 minutes of holy confusion. Then there's the helmet problem. Knights wore heavy metal helmets that blocked not just vision but also context. From a distance, a salute looked a lot like an insult. There are actual records from English chronicles describing duels that began because two knights thought they were exchanging polite greetings. One knight raised his visor, a gesture of respect. The other thought it was a challenge. 5 minutes later, they're dueling to the death over a misread hello. It's like starting a sword fight because someone misinterpreted your emoji. Gestures were also used for covert commands, especially among commanders who wanted to outsmart spies or eavesdroppers. The problem? Everyone copied everyone else. If your enemy figured out your secret signals, you were done. One famous case happened during the 100 Years' War, when an English scout noticed that the French used a raised spear to mean advance quietly. So during the next battle, he mimicked the gesture. The French cavalry charged directly into an ambush, and just like that, one sneaky hand signal changed the course of a fight. Moral of the story: if you're going to invent a secret code, don't perform it in front of thousands of people, but perhaps the deadliest misunderstanding of all came from a gesture we still use today, the thumbs up. You've seen it in movies. The medieval knight gives a thumbs up before a joust. But historically, that gesture was not universal. In some regions of Europe, a thumbs up meant approval. In others, it was a vulgar insult, the medieval equivalent of flipping the bird. So when an English commander gave a cheerful thumbs up to a German ally in 1415, let's just say the alliance didn't last long. It's not easy to fight side by side when your general just told you to shove it. Even among peasants and militia, hand signals were dangerous. In towns that relied on bells for alerts, guards often used gestures from watchtowers to communicate at night. But torches flickered, fog rolled in, and sometimes a warning signal looked suspiciously like a "we're safe" signal. The result? Half the town sleeping soundly while the other half burns. One chronicler from 1358 dryly noted, "They mistook the waving of the torch for joy. The joy was brief." That's the kind of line you only write after watching your city catch fire. But gestures didn't just kill people, they also saved them. There's a famous story from the Battle of Nicopolis, 1396. A young knight, captured and kneeling before execution, clasped his hands together, the universal gesture of prayer. The executioner mistook it for surrender. The Sultan, amused by the knight's apparent humility, spared him. That simple hand movement turned death into mercy. So yes, gestures could destroy armies, but sometimes they bought you one more day to breathe. By the late Middle Ages, military leaders finally realized hand gestures alone weren't enough. They started using banners, drums, and horns instead, because a flag can't be misread as an insult. Probably, still, even then, soldiers continued to salute, wave, and signal, each time risking a misunderstanding that could undo months of planning. If history teaches us anything, it's this: communication kills more than swords ever did. So next time you wave at someone from across the street, be grateful you're not in the 14th century, where a friendly hey might be the last thing you ever do. The Middle Ages were full of gestures, not just for love or war, but for something much deeper: fear of bad luck. See, medieval people didn't have weather forecasts, antibiotics, or Google, so when things went wrong, plague, fire, sudden death by goat, they blamed it on curses, demons, or the evil eye, and naturally they came up with gestures to protect themselves. Because when you don't understand science, waving your hands at invisible forces feels like a solid plan. Let's start with the most famous, crossing your fingers. Today, it's something you do for good luck or when you're lying through your teeth. But in the early Middle Ages, crossing fingers was a miniature prayer. It symbolized the intersection of divine protection, literally forming the sign of the cross with your own hand. Christians used it secretly when they couldn't pray out loud, especially during persecution. But, as usual, the gesture evolved. By the 14th century, peasants started doing it for everything before gambling, before giving birth, even before sneezing. If you crossed your fingers too often, it basically became the medieval version of refreshing your luck meter. There's even a joke from a 15th century French manuscript. A man crossed his fingers so much his hand forgot how to be open. So yes, superstition was handcrafted. Next, let's talk about touching wood, or as they called it, knocking on holy timber. People in the Middle Ages genuinely believed that spirits lived inside trees, especially oaks. To touch wood was to summon divine protection, or to thank the spirits for keeping you alive another day without being eaten by wolves or taxed by nobles, which were basically the same thing. The idea probably came from earlier pagan traditions. Druids believed trees housed guardian spirits. Christians later repackaged it as touching the cross. Either way, the logic was simple. Wood equals holy equals please don't smite me. If someone bragged too much, like, my cow hasn't died this winter, their friend would instantly touch wood to block the curse. It was medieval social media etiquette. No humble bragging without a knock. Comma. Then there's the charmingly gross one, spitting for luck. Yes, really. Spitting was practically a national sport in medieval Europe. People spat to bless, to ward off demons. And sometimes, just because hygiene wasn't a thing yet, if you were about to do something risky, go to war, start a journey, or even roll dice, you'd spit first. It was thought to confuse the devil, who supposedly followed people around, waiting to curse them. Some even spat on their children's heads to protect them from the evil eye. Imagine trying that at a modern daycare. And when people made deals, they'd sometimes spit into their hands before shaking, sealing the contract in truth and saliva. Nothing says trust like mutual germs. Another favorite, making the sign of the horns. You've probably seen it, 2 fingers extended. Others folded the rock and roll gesture. In medieval times, it wasn't for concerts. It was for exorcism. People believed that evil spirits could enter through your eyes. So whenever they saw something suspicious, like a witch or a woman reading, they'd flash the horns to scare the demon away. In Italy, it became known as la corna, and it's still used today to ward off bad luck. Just be careful, because in Spain, the same gesture meant your spouse was cheating. Nothing like a hand sign that can mean both protection from Satan and your wife's with the baker, and of course, the evil eye, that invisible curse everyone was terrified of. If someone looked at you too long, complimented you too nicely, or stared at your cow, people assumed jealousy was poisoning the air. So they fought back with gestures. There were dozens of them. The fig thumb between fingers to mock the devil, the horns to block curses, the crossed fingers for divine help, and, in some regions, showing your backside because nothing says go away. Evil like mooning a demon. One English folktale even says farmers flashed their butts at thunderclouds to make storms go away. Did it work? No. Was it funny? Absolutely. Then there's the gesture of blessing, one of the most recognizable symbols in medieval art. Priests held their hands with 2 fingers up and 2 down, symbolizing the dual nature of Christ, divine and human. It was used in icons, paintings, and even on coins. But here's the twist. The exact way you held your fingers depended on your region. Western Europe used one formation, Eastern Orthodox used another, so when missionaries from one side visited the other, they sometimes accused each other of heresy simply for blessing people wrong. Imagine getting excommunicated because your fingers weren't positioned correctly. That's medieval car for you. Even gestures for luck in love had their quirks. In some regions, women touched iron or wore small metal rings to anchor their hearts. Men, meanwhile, made secret signs, like tracing a cross over their chest before meeting someone they liked, or tapping their boots 3 times before speaking. Basically, superstition turned flirting into a full-body workout. What's amazing is how many of these gestures survived. We still cross our fingers. We still knock on wood. We still throw hand signs for luck, even if we don't know why. They're fossilized rituals, tiny remnants of a time when every twitch of a hand meant life, death, or demonic possession. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. Because deep down, we still want to believe our hands can change the world. Even if now, it's just by hitting, like instead of ward off Satan, in a world without texting, emojis, or memes. Gestures were the universal medieval language. They could bless you, curse you, or, in the wrong context, get you slapped by a bishop. Every flick of the wrist, every raised finger, every subtle nod carried meaning. Hands were not just tools, they were weapons, prayers, and scandals all rolled into one. If you could time travel to a medieval town square, you'd be overwhelmed by hand signals. 2 merchants sealing a deal by spitting on their palms. A priest blessing a crowd with 2 raised fingers. A peasant making the sign of the horns at a cat because he thinks it's possessed. You'd see monks communicating silently in monasteries, knights raising fingers in salute, and lovers making secret signs behind their backs. It was like watching a never-ending, sweaty game of charades. But to them, these gestures were serious business, because when words could be dangerous, hands became your safest language. The funny part is, half the time, no one agreed on what the gestures actually meant. A nod in France could mean yes, but in England, it might mean, I don't trust you. The same gesture of 2 fingers could mean blessing, defiance, or the number 2, depending on whether you were in church or a tavern. Medieval communication was basically one big misinterpretation party. There's even a 13th century record of a noble being challenged to a duel because his hand wave was mistaken for an insult. The chronicler simply wrote, "He waved with the wrong number of fingers." And that, my friend, is peak medieval drama. But these gestures weren't just about confusion. They were about survival. In a time when literacy was rare, gestures were the language of the people. They let a beggar ask for food, a traveler request mercy, or a sinner beg forgiveness. Your hands could say things your tongue couldn't. That's why churches developed entire systems of sacred gestures to teach faith visually, and why thieves and mercenaries created their own signs to identify allies in the shadows. Everyone, from priests to pickpockets, spoke with their hands. And then came the punishments. Because, of course, the Middle Ages couldn't let people have fun gestures without some kind of horrifying consequence. Raise the wrong finger at the wrong person. You could be branded for disrespect. Use a sacred sign during gambling. That was blasphemy. Enjoy a public whipping. Mock a noble's salute. Your hand might not stay attached for long. The medieval justice system basically said, if your gesture offends, you won't be gesturing again, which, in fairness, did cut down on rude hand signals quite effectively. Yet somehow, despite all that fear, the gestures survived. They slipped through centuries of change, outliving kings, wars, and entire languages. We don't bow to lords anymore, but we still shake hands. We don't fear witches, but we still knock on wood. We don't ward off demons, but we still cross our fingers before a big exam. Our hands remember what our minds forgot. Every casual gesture you make today, waving hello, giving a thumbs up, even flipping someone off in traffic, is part of a long, unbroken chain that stretches back to the Middle Ages. And maybe that's the real secret language of gestures. They connect us, not just to each other, but to everyone who ever lived before us, the farmers, the monks, the fools, the kings, all trying to make sense of life, one awkward hand motion at a time. So the next time you wave, point, or cross your fingers, just remember, you're speaking the same silent language as a medieval peasant, a bishop, and probably a terrified court jester who just sneezed near the king. History isn't dead. It's waving at you, literally. And that's the end of our little dive into medieval body language. If you enjoyed being mildly educated and moderately confused, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and wave your hand dramatically at the algorithm, because if medieval people taught us anything, it's this. Sometimes one good gesture can change your fate, or at least get you a few more views. This is Boring History Sleep, signing off, one awkward hand at a time.